It is my pleasure to introduce Tomek, and he's going to be talking about temporary access to the cloud. Take it away, Tomek.
Cool. All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming out. Thank you. Thank you. This is temporary access to the cloud, a case study. I'm going to take a moment here to appreciate my giant face on a movie theater screen. That's so cool. Brad Pitt was up there. I'm not Brad Pitt. I'm Tomas Rabczak. I'm a staff software engineer at Chime. We have a lot to cover in this talk, so I'm just going to go straight into it. Let's go over the agenda here. We're going to talk about the problem. We're going to go into ideation and data gathering, where we kind of collected metrics around access usage at Chime. Then we're going to dive into the design and development of the actual application, so we'll deep dive into the architecture. We'll roll into product metrics, which is kind of like a new obsession of mine. We'll talk about the rollout and how that went, especially kind of from the perspective of a culture where folks were used to having permanent access and moving it to temporary. And then we'll finish it off with a retrospective, kind of looking at what went well, what maybe didn't go so well, and if we were to do it over again, what we might do differently. Cool. So the problem, employees as an attack vector. This next slide is kind of funny because the access talk from the Discord team presented this same metric, but it's awesome. This one's from the 2024 data breach. But again, 68% of breaches involved a human element. Just always a staggering metric. They recently changed it for 2024 to not include like malicious insiders. So these are potentially just folks that are getting exploited for their access and not meaning to do it. And yeah, there's the headlines to back it up too. Plenty of headlines to share. Uber being hacked, Microsoft engineer's account likely led to the hack, Zendesk falling for a phishing attack, Twilio suffered an attack. Hackers claim it only took a 10-minute phone call to shut down MGM Resorts. So that happened recently, you may remember. And then this one is the absolute crazy one that's like happening with the AI stuff. A hacker deepfakes an employee's voice in a phone call to breach the IT company, according to Retool, which that's just crazy. Okay. So yeah, ideation and data gathering. So now that we've kind of presented the problem, let's see if we can see what this problem looks like at Chime. And so to kind of step back a little bit, about where the impetus of this came from. Segment actually had released a blog post called Access Service, Temporary Access to the Cloud, which is a great blog post where they lay out a similar service that they built, kind of talking about the same things we'll be talking about today. And so it was Mukund that saw this one and then brought it to the team, and we decided to try to build this ourselves as well. One thing that was really cool was we actually had a call with Segment before we started building this to kind of get their thoughts, how things went building it out, if they had any other recommendations. We talked about like build versus buy, which we'll talk about later in the presentation. But it's not something that I would have thought to do. But now that I'm like on the other side of it, it would be totally cool if anybody came up to me and wanted to like talk more about this. So this kind of cross-company collaboration, I think we should be doing like way more of it. Cool. So this is kind of pretty similar to what our applications look like. There's a lot of data in this table, but this is breaking down all of the access across some of our top Okta groups. And so you'll see things up here like AWS, Snowflake, StrongDM is a software as a service that provides management for EKS and Kubernetes. And then we have some internal applications here. But what I wanted to focus on was this right-hand side. So this is breaking down the users that have access. What percentage of those users have actually logged in the last 30 days and used that access? So the green side represents users that have logged in, and the gray side represents users that have not logged in the last 30 days. So pretty staggering metrics, and that the gray part is sort of our attack surface here. This is like the problem in data. And so what we're trying to do here is minimize that gray area as much as possible. Cool. So design and development. So kind of borrowing from Segment's access service, the goals that we set out for is that we wanted to make this self-service, sort of going off of the idea of the shift left, empowering engineers and other team members, non-security team members, to get work done, but make things more secure. Another thing is having this be just-in-time access. And so you're requesting access for when you need it. Streamlining the approval flows, making sure that it's easy for folks to actually find the access they need and then get it quickly, but have it be approved and someone's looking at it to make sure that they need that access. A final point here is providing quick access in the case of like emergencies and incidents. So, if you have an application or a group that has some approvers and there's an incident that happens at 3 o'clock in the morning, those approvers aren't going to be available to give access. So we need some kind of break glass scenario to allow users to be able to get that access in the case of an emergency. So that's something that's in the back of our mind as well. Cool. So before we kind of deep dive into the architecture of the service itself, this is all built on top of Okta, which is our single sign-on provider. I'm sure many folks have heard of Okta. Just TLDR, it manages user identities, as well as applications and then groups. So you can assign groups to applications, put people into those groups, users, and then that kind of manages the access. You can do some nice things like enforce multi-factor authentication, but one of the features that we took advantage of right off of the from the beginning was the support for SCIM-based access management, and that's important enough that I've put a slide for it. So if folks haven't heard of SCIM before, it's the System for Cross-Domain Identity Management, and really all it is that it's a specification for where you provide a set of ultimately like REST CRUD APIs for user and group management inside of your application. And so this is nice because you can utilize SCIM. A provider like Okta can utilize SCIM and create these integrations with other applications where, from our perspective, we don't have to worry about the application. We just use Okta to put a user into a group, and through the SCIM protocol, all of the user management operations happen in the background. And so what that means is that we don't have to write any custom application code. So when we put a user to a group in Okta, we don't have to write custom application code to go call an API for X application to do some extra user management there. So that was a nice feature going that route. All right, so what does access service look like from an architecture perspective? It's really just kind of a pretty basic web service that sits on top of the Okta API. And really the foundational API calls for Okta that we use is add a user to a group and remove user from a group. Backed by Postgres, you'll see that there's no lines, again, connecting us to the applications. We're utilizing SCIM to handle all that for us. We have some cron jobs in terms of syncing state from Okta. So you need to know who the users are of the company, who their managers are, which groups should access service care about, because we don't onboard all of the Okta groups and all the applications. We pick and choose which ones get into access service. Cron jobs to expire the access request, 15 minutes, same as the Discord one. Fetch usage events, that's an interesting one because, and we'll talk about this feature later, we use that to enable activity refresh for access. And just a TLDR of that for now is it means if you use your access, it'll get extended. And so we use Panther as our SIEM, that's our centralized audit log store. And so we can query Panther for various applications to see whether or not you've authenticated to it. We send notifications via Slack to both the requesters and the reviewers. Reviewers can review access requests through Slack. They don't have to go through the UI. I mentioned the emergency request feature. We utilize a service called Tines, which hooks into our security operations center. So anytime you create an emergency access request, our security operations center gets notified, and they'll follow up to make sure that that isn't suspicious. Cool. So this is the demo. Let me see if I can full screen this. All right, so this is what the application looks like. What I'm going to show here is me accessing a Kubernetes group. And we'll go and create a new access request. You have the ability to search for your group. This is a Kubernetes group that actually allows for instant access because it's non-prod. And I'll pause here. No, I won't. Sorry about that. No pausing. So you have the option to choose activity-based, which we talked about earlier. You give a business justification. You can choose whether or not emergency access, but we're not going to here. Once you submit it, because this is a non-prod group, you immediately get access to it and becomes active. And you'll see when I toggle SDM, it's that quick. Like you get access to the Kubernetes cluster. And so you also have the option to revoke that access, which the user can do, and also the resource owners and a manager if they have the permissions. So here we revoke it, and you'll see the cluster goes away. And we'll dig into these flows a little bit more. But yeah, so some key implementation features from the service. I'd say syncing the state with Okta is kind of one of the trickiest parts. It's a little bit tedious, making sure that you're syncing that state properly because you're calling the Okta APIs to get all the users, trying to make the manager connections, the Okta groups. I'm actually looking into utilizing Skim in access service itself to get sort of webhook events from Okta about new users and groups. And so I would be able to get rid of the cron jobs, which I think might actually work and would be a nice addition. Sync tasks should be idempotent. Cron jobs fail. When they run again, they need to not mangle the state. Everything that talks to a third party is asynchronous, including the calls to the Okta API. Okta API has insane limits on their API, and it's both at the application level and on an organization level, which I'll dig into later on in the presentation. Minimizing third-party dependencies. This is a very sensitive application, and so we want to make sure that it's as secure as possible because any potential vulnerabilities or authorization bypasses could be a really big deal. Reviews are only required for production groups, so everything else is instant access and no one has to review. And then the last one here is that I'm kind of a lazy developer, so the less I have to manage, the easier my job is. And so kind of taking that shift left mentality, all of the group and approver configurations are in Terraform, and the resource owners themselves can just make PRs and onboard applications, onboard groups themselves. And so that means less things that we need to manage ourselves. So very simple, this is what a configuration looks like in Terraform. You're giving it the name of an Okta group, a description that's gonna help requesters be able to find that role easier. The approval type here, there's one of three. No approval, that's the instant access. Owner manager here means that either the resource owner or the requester's manager can approve the request. And then the last one is owner only. And so that doesn't allow a requester's manager to approve it. And then you just specify the approvers as emails. Cool, and so what does that look like when you actually apply this? These properties that we're using are they're custom Okta group profile attributes. So the one in the middle here is just a Boolean flag. That's actually what we're querying on the back end when we go to list the groups so that access service knows which groups it should care about. We have the approval type there, which is an enum. And then this service is just all Okta groups everywhere. So the approvers, we actually create another group to house the approvers. And so in this example, you have this theoretical application called app1admin. We go and create an approvers group for that application, put those users in it. And so our cron jobs go and query that to actually set up the state in our internal database. Said it was gonna get low level. Okay, emergency access requests. So this is what it looks like when you make an emergency access request. You see a banner that says like, hey, heads up, you need to share the link to this request with anyone that has access to access service. And so this is kind of the middle ground that we decided on. We didn't want emergency access to be instantaneous access to production groups. We wanted there to be still some kind of control. And given that the reason we built this feature was to respond to incidents, the way that our incident process works at Chime is that there's at least 2 people that respond to it. There's usually going to be some kind of engineer, and then there's going to be an incident coordinator. So you're always supposed to have someone else that you can share this access request to get access to. And some teams will sort of proactively put themselves into these groups based off of on-call, pager duty things. That's a feature in the backlog to try to do that automatically, but it's not something we do today. Cool. So yeah, this is again what the form looks like. We have the ability to do activity-based or standard. Most of our users go with activity-based. This is the state diagram for an access request. It goes from pending, you can cancel it, or wait on a review decision. If you get an approval, it goes into processing, which we actually added recently because we were hitting the Okta API rate limits. So in the UI, when folks were approving a request, it would just hang for up to a minute because the backend was waiting for that rate limit to get reset. So we had to move that to a background async job and then add this processing state. So it's really just like a transitory state that's in there for maybe like a second or two before it moves to active. And so from that point, it can either expire or users, managers, or resource owners can revoke that request. This is the Slack integration. So this is what the reviewer sees when they get an access request to review. They can approve, deny, or view the request in the UI. If they deny the request, they're going to see a modal that's going to require them to put a reason that they're denying the request. Once that request is approved, again, we're sending out notifications to multiple reviewers. So we have to go and update all of those notifications and switch it to showing that it's actually already been reviewed, which is a pretty nice feature because before this, reviewers would go into the UI and see that it's already been approved, which was a little bit of a pain because you couldn't do it through Slack and you had to be on the VPN. So this was kind of a nice feature. I think the GitHub Slack bot does a similar thing, which this was motivated by. This is what the requester sees in Slack. When they've been granted access, they get a warning message before their access expires, and then they get another message when it's actually expired with a link to re-request. All right, audit events. So yeah, audit events are very important for access service, not only for our auditors, but also for us in the case where we need to maybe debug an issue. Users can also see the audit events for themselves. And so yeah, you can export to a CSV here, which is what our auditors use to review access. Cool. Product metrics. Yeah, so product metrics I feel like is not really a thing that the security industry, security engineers maybe have utilized very heavily in the past. And I'm here to make a case that it's like very awesome and everyone should utilize product metrics if they can. I think for 2 important reasons in my opinion. One, for example, the top one is permanent versus temporary access. This was our North Star metric. And so this is what we were looking at to try to drive down permanent access. So having like a Looker dashboard that showed that, that broke it down across all apps and then for individual ones, it was just really useful. You can take a screenshot, put it into a metrics meeting. But the other one is also that it just like shows that the application is alive and working, which sounds weird to say. Previously, maybe you would open up some kind of development console and call like .count on access requests and be like, all right, that number went up, cool. Like things are theoretically working. But when you break down the metrics into these individual parts, it really just kind of brings the application alive and also allows you to really monitor and set up alerts on things. So these are just some examples. In terms of monitoring metrics, these are things that you might like set up alerts for, right? So groups that require an approval, but there are no or a low number of approvers, folks leave the company. And so Alice and Bob, if they both leave the company, you now have a group that requires an approval, but they don't have any. Other interesting metrics, just like median approval times, stale requests, ones that have been in a pending state for more than 5 days. Segment, again, had a blog post just about tracking meaningful security product metrics, which I'd recommend. Cool. So here's some examples. This is kind of like that North Star metric that I was talking about. This is an application, name's been changed, but this represents an application that used to be fully permanent, and then we transitioned it to temporary. And so all of the people that had access to this, you're seeing about like 900 on the bottom. After 30 days, which is what we defaulted the migration to, 50% of that access dropped off. And that number, 50%, has been pretty consistent with the numbers that we've been seeing across these migrations. And so like that dip right there is like all of the value of this product. So just like seeing that, I don't know, it sounds stupid and simple, but there it is, it's working. All right, rollout. Some may be wondering, how long did this take to build? I went back to GitHub and looked at the first commit. That was February of 2022. In October of 2022, we did a soft release, which meant that you can still request access the old way, which was through an IT ask channel, or you can request access through access service. In February 2023, 1 year after the first commit, we did a production cutover. And so all requests for the supported applications have to go through access service. In May of 2023, we rolled out activity refresh, which is if you use it, it'll get extended. If not, it expires. And then September 2023 is when we started moving all existing permanent access to temporary. And that's something that we're still working on today. Cool. So for that rollout, the plan here was to first start by dogfooding access service just within the security team. So the idea here was, people would remove access for themselves that they had that was permanent. From that point forward, they would request access from access service, got feedback, iterated on things. The next step was to choose an external team that had a good track record with us, that had worked with us in the past, and had the track record of championing security. And so then we used access service with them, got feedback and iterated. From that point forward, we made groups available to all users. That's the point in the timeline where you could either go through IT ask or through access service. At that point, we were in a pretty good state, and we were kind of ready to really make this the main path to get access for engineers. But we needed to get sort of the buy-in first from the engineering organization. So we started doing roadshows for our internal engineering teams, leadership and stakeholders. And so this was really us just kind of meeting with the individual leadership teams and showing them access service, presenting the problem, showing them the metrics of like, hey, look at all the access that's out there and how much is actually being used. And so getting them on board first before we started to roll it out, this was a real key thing that I think contributed to the success of the rollout. Then transition to permanent access. We've got access service ask channel in Slack for any questions that come up. We also did a pre-mortem, which is interesting. I've never done one of those before. So the idea here is that, unlike a post-mortem, you do this before things go bad, and you try to think of the things that might go wrong with the application before they do, and then sort of potentially retroactively fix them. So we identified, security bugs. That would be, it's kind of an easy one. We talked about Okta API rate limits, where the approvals are out of office. That's something that drove some features, long wait times, pending requests, the break glass scenario for emergency access. All these things came up in the pre-mortem. Cool. Changing a culture of persistent access. After we rolled this out, and folks started having to make requests to access service, we started getting a very common question in our access service ask channel. And all these questions are, hey, it looks like I can only request 1 month. How do I get permanent access? And so these questions kept on coming in. And so we had to start working on this idea of changing the culture of persistent access. We talked about the roadshows that we did. So I think from that perspective, we had leadership on board. But we needed to start creating features that helped kind of reduce friction and made it easier. So I think that was a valid thing. People saying, hey, like I'm using this access all the time. Like, why is it expiring? And then you're just making me create another request like immediately, which I think was valid. And so we went the route with, all right, if you are using your access and we can tell, then we'll refresh it for you. But if you don't use that access, it'll expire. Another one that was popular was we actually switched it over, having instant access for roles that weren't production. This enabled a lot of people to get access, do debugging. So that was a popular feature. The emergency access in the case of incidents. And so what we're working on right now is we have a 90-day cap on access. It's just what lines up with our quarterly access reviews for our auditors. And so before access service, that would just be, managers get a batch of access and they have to go through and reapprove it. So we're building that into access service to allow managers to just reapprove that. And so from that perspective, if folks are using it, they have that track record, managers can extend that access for them. Cool. And so then we started getting feedback that people liked it. This is another thing where I think being in the security industry, this is not a common thing to get people that like the thing that you're working on. Also sounds weird, but that's just like the nature of it. And so that's why I think sort of moving toward a culture where you're actually building things that both secure your company and enable people, that's kind of a nice marriage there because you get positive feedback from it. Here's some positive feedback on the instant access feature. This is my favorite one, when folks are pessimistic about the service before it rolls out, and then they get won over. That there's just something special about that. Cool. Retrospective. All right, so build versus buy. We actually met with a lot of vendors to talk about this. At the time, there wasn't a huge amount, but this list has just grown quite a lot. And pretty consistently across all these vendors, the one concern that we had that was a blocker for us was that we had to hand over an Okta super admin API key. This is the keys to the castle to your entire company. And so that just wasn't a risk that we were comfortable taking on. And so we decided to build it ourselves. At the time, access was not available to us, but shout out to Discord for open sourcing their version. That is awesome. I very much would love to open source access service, and it's something I'm working on. But this is definitely bumping it up to the top of the backlog. Okay, not so good. Okta API rate limits. So I don't have a lot of time here. Yes, it's on the application level and the organization level. So what does the organization level mean? That means that access services Okta API key could knock out requests across the entire organization. So any application utilizing an Okta API key could get blocked because I've made too many requests. So we had to be very sensitive to that. And in fact, we have logic that backs off before we hit the rate limit to make sure we don't actually hit the rate limit. When we moved StrongDM over to Skim, that ended up adding a lot of new users and a lot of new seat licenses, which ended up being expensive. Discoverability is still a problem that we're working with. I think the tagging feature in Discord's access is really neat in trying to help users find the role that they actually need, and that's something that we're still actively working on. The request for permanent access came in, but I would say that this is tapered off. And really, we're only seeing that for new folks that maybe come to the company and they're not used to access service. One other thing is that we did not do a great job committing to the temporary access during the rollout. We were kind of on the fence and fuzzy about it because folks would come in saying hey, I just need to do my job. Can you give me a birthright rule to this group? We'd be all right, maybe we can make an exception. And so I think the right thing would have been to just really commit to, hey, this is what we're going to be using. Hopefully we've built this service in a way that makes it easier for you. And if it isn't, please let us know and we'll try to work on that. Snowflake role grants, I wish I can get into, but that would take me 10 minutes. The TLDR of that is that you can stack Snowflake roles hierarchically, and so it's very difficult to do usage attribution on a role level for Snowflake. But if anyone wants to talk about that, I'm happy to do it. So what went well? Yeah, I think we created an application that both enabled engineers and then pretty significantly reduced our attack surface. By limiting app integrations to ones that support Skim, it meant that we don't have to write the custom code. It also pushed us to move existing apps to Skim, which is ultimately a better system for us. The slow and iterative rollout with the dogfooding gave us a lot of opportunity to make sure that the user interface and the user experience was solid before it went out to the company. Yeah, so I think we also did a pretty good job for articulating what the access sprawl issue was like to the leadership. Instant access, again, was a really popular feature. We had the emergency access. That was something that a lot of folks were hesitant about. I said that we spent money on seat licenses, but you can also save money on seat licenses. There are some applications that users might request access to, and they maybe use it once, and they don't use it again, so when that expires, they get removed, and the seat license gets removed. That can save you money. The access refresh feature, having our usage events query a single place, that being Panther, also forced us to get more logs into Panther, which having a centralized place for those audit logs is a good win too. Cool. Things that I would have done differently if I started over. We started on the level of Okta groups, and we've pretty much ignored the entity of an Okta application. And I think that was not as an efficient of a move. And if I were to do it over again, I would start at the Okta application because you can utilize the app group assignments and just query that off of the application. I think I saw Discord's Access also do that. And so I'm actually going to be moving toward that model in the next sprint. Oh, yes, so this is cool. For the usage events, this idea of powering activity refresh, I was all in on, I want to get role level attribution. If you are looking at data read versus just infra read, for example, I want to know that you're using those specific roles. I've been recently rolling out just have you logged into the application? Not if you've used the role, just have you opened the application and successfully authenticated to it as a user. That's going to get you actually pretty far. So the Zendesk graph that I showed you with that huge 50% drop, that was utilizing in the back end just did you log into Zendesk? So I think I would have started there. It's great to have usage events and configurations on the Okta group level, but yeah, that's something I'd point out. Big shout out to the team. Yeah, this is great effort. We're on year 2 right now. So yeah, and questions, I guess. Thank you.
All right, big thank you to our speaker Tomas. We are, as per usual, taking questions via Slido. If you haven't already set that up, it is bsidessf.org/Q&A, and that will contain information on how to submit questions. We have quite a backlog of questions for you. There's a lot of interest in this talk. First question, how many people are responsible for ongoing internal maintenance, support, and enhancements?
Support and enhancements, I'd say 2, technically. Yeah, so it's me, and then as of recently, Sahana has been helping out with new features. And then in terms of maintenance, we get some help from IT support, Rory's from IT engineering, but this idea that a lot of the configurations live outside of access service, not a lot of required. Thankfully, things don't break, so I guess I'm good at my job. But yeah.
All right, next question. Any thoughts about role-based access? It seems to be in tension with the idea of pruning unused permissions.
Of role-based access. Yeah, and I think that is something that we are using here. And so I think from a pattern, we are transitioning more toward team roles. But from access services perspective, it doesn't really care about those things. Everything's just an Okta group on the back end. So if you want to call it payments processing team, or you want to call it processing service cluster access. Access service doesn't care about it. So yeah, it's more of a strategic thing on the company, how you want to organize your Okta groups. But yeah, I think that seems to be a good way to go.
All right, next question. Were there any concerns around reliability? Did you need a fallback plan if the service goes down?
Yeah, so again, not all of our applications are onboarded to access service. And so there is still the way, the sort of legacy method or the alternative method is going through IT ask. And so in the case where it is 3 o'clock in the morning, you're responding to an incident and access service is down, then we would page someone from IT or someone that has access to be able to add that person to the group. But it hasn't happened yet.
Knock on wood. Next question.
It's just paper.
Have you had any issues with less technical folks having trouble setting up a new group with Terraform?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Up until this point, we've only been working primarily with engineers and engineering teams. With onboarding Zendesk and some of our customer support tooling, that the pool and the demographic of users has definitely opened up. And so I think from that perspective, we're still there to help in that transition. But we have like plenty of PRs and examples that show how to do it. And it was like 4 lines. So still pretty easy.
Next. Oh, sadly archived one. But I believe the question was, what's the timeline on open sourcing?
That's a great question. I don't have an answer, unfortunately. I mean, it would be awesome if we can get it out by the end of the year. I built the application with the intent of open sourcing it. And so I tried to keep as many sort of internal Chime dependencies out of the application as possible. But the way that our infrastructure works, that some of that just wasn't possible. So I just have to figure out how to kind of make those dependencies optional or be able to remove them so that it doesn't get in the way of other people integrating it.
Outside of the Okta superadmin topic, what were your main reasons for building versus buying a solution?
I think outside of the Okta superadmin one, which was definitely the biggest one, on its surface, the service didn't seem that complicated to build. I'd mentioned in the architecture slide that you're calling 2 APIs, ultimately, add and remove user from group. I mean, it definitely has been more complicated than that, especially as we build out the features. But yeah, I think it was something where we wanted to keep that risk in-house, and it just seemed like a feasible and doable thing within a relatively short time frame.
How do you onboard new AWS accounts? Is this automated?
Yeah, so those 4 lines that I mentioned, it's pretty much that. You just add a new one. There's some infrastructure that has to, some other TF changes that have to happen in the background. But from the perspective of access service, it's just adding those 4 lines and pointing it at the AWS role. So we have SSO and SCIM set up for AWS, so it all automatically just happens.
All right. Next question. Interpreted a little bit. Why bother with requests for non-production networks? What additional capability are you getting if you're already enforcing MFA?
Okay, so the question here is, why are we enforcing some kind of request to be created for non-production accounts, but we're enforcing MFA? So yeah, we are enforcing MFA on the Okta and like having to log in potentially at the time. But at first it was that we had sort of everything going through an approval process, and then we migrated toward the non-prod becoming instant access. But yeah, I guess maybe it was just like already part of the system, and it's pretty easy to request that access. So no one's actually complained about that one yet, but if they do.
Great. Last question we have on the docket. As authentication events might be used for centralized applications like AWS SSO, Are there any other recommendations on this parameter?
Yeah. So I mentioned the things that I would do differently. Just looking at authentication SSO will get you pretty far. Again, we did start with role level attribution. And so we do have role level attribution for AWS, right? So there's going to be a CloudTrail log that gets created. That's an assume role event. And so we do query those, and we have role level attribution for AWS, for StrongDM, for Snowflake, minus the role hierarchy stuff that we're dealing with. So those applications do support it. And it makes total sense for those where you have hundreds of roles for one application. But as we onboard more applications, we're finding that they're internal applications with 4, 5, 6 roles, that the application auth works well.
All right, we had a couple more questions trickle in if you're ready for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
First one, how much concern is there around the emergency break glass feature being used as an attack vector before you can respond to an event?
I think the fact that we still require some other form of approval. So 2 things are ultimately still required. You need to be creating the request from a managed device, because you can only create requests through the UI. And so you have to be able to log in on the VPN, which requires a managed device. Then you don't get instant access to that. You still need to get it approved by someone. And so you would need to collude with another person, another person at the company. Granted, reviews can happen through Slack off VPN, but the request has to be made on VPN. And so you still need someone that has access to access service, that's a user and access service. So with those 2 things combined, and the additional layer that we send alerts to our security operations center to follow up on these things, I think that I feel like we're in a pretty good spot there.
Great. We have more questions trickling in. We have the room for another 3 minutes. I'm going to try and get through as many of these as we can, and we're going to have to cut it off there.
Sure.
Next question is from Rohit. Would you have bought rather than built? What features should have Okta offered to make this easier for a wider range of companies?
Yeah, I think I haven't surveyed the landscape of what the buys would look like now. We Discord open source their access. That would absolutely be the first thing that I would look at. But in terms of buying, if it's not the super admin key or features that Okta could provide, one thing that's annoying is that the Okta API kind of makes it difficult to not make lots of requests. And that is why we hit these Okta API rate limits a lot. I'm constantly making a request for one resource and then making many requests for others, things like Okta groups and getting who's in the approvers. So I think there's some tweaks that could happen in the API to make that schema look a little bit better and a little bit nicer to query. Also, Okta could probably build this feature into their application. You all should do it. If there's somebody here, do it. Because people are building this. I know that other people have built this. We know Discord built it, Chime's built it, but I know other people that have built this internally. And so they're just like, we've recreated the wheel as an industry so many times for this problem. And so I feel like it should be a native feature.
All right, next question. Oh, give him an applause if you want. It's a great talk. Next question. Does this have capabilities to grant temporary access to things like SSH or RDP servers, or is this just limited to SSO apps in Okta that are onboarded to the access?
Yeah, just SSO apps. This is, fully Okta. Service on Okta.
All right, last question. I can partially answer this. Will the slides be made public? If you're not already aware, BSides records all of these talks. They're being live streamed to YouTube now. Recorded talks will be released at some point in the future. Do you have plans to release the slides from the talk as well?
Yeah. I'd love to share them and make them available wherever. I don't know if BSides has a page for that, but can figure something out there.
All right, that's it for our questions. We're coming up at the top of the hour. Thanks again to Tomas for this excellent presentation. Thank you, audience, for all the great questions. Have a goodie bag for you here.
Thank you so much for your time.